So, first of all, thank you for that very warm introduction. I always it's incredibly kind, and it's very easy to be friendly in the FT because my colleagues are, of course, all incredibly wonderful people. Some of them are occasionally, of course not Darcy, intellectually confused, but it's my job to put them right. I thought the previous discussion was wonderful, very, very educational, and it confirmed something that I thought for a very long time, which is that US culture is really weird. And I spent the first 10 years of my working life working in the United States, though not for a strictly speaking American organization. And of course, I've worked in the FT with many American colleagues. The one final introduction I can't resist making, as has been pointed out, I became a commander of the British Empire in 2000. And when I consider this particular honor, I like to tell people that it shows that whatever else the British have lost in the last half century, they haven't lost their sense of humor, since there can't be many of you who remember there really was a British Empire, and we will certainly continue to be giving this honor long after everybody has forgotten. It would be like the Italians giving the honor of the Roman Empire. So I've been given 20 minutes to discuss everything in economics, and I won't manage it, but what I'm going to do is try and cover 4 questions. Anyone who reads my columns, I take it for granted you all read my columns, of course, will know I always start with questions, so there are at least 2 here. So I'm going to start by saying very, very briefly, because I think it's important, what I see as the economic context for what's going on. Then I'm going to talk about why Brexit happened. Why did we have this outcome? I'm not going to discuss why we had the referendum, not because I don't have very strong views about it, though it's more about politics than economics, but because I just don't have time. I'm happy to discuss it later. Then I'm going to talk briefly about what next, mostly for the UK, a bit for Europe, and then finally what I think are some of the wider implications. My big story, which is more based on hunch than anything else, but I've been around a long time, my professional life has been nearly 50 years, is that I think we might be in a real regime shift period in world history, a profound change in the world in which a Western-dominated globalization process is coming to an end. And what is not quite clear to me whether it's the Western-dominated part, which we've already heard about, or the globalization process, or both that are coming to an end. But I have a sense that something very, very deep and profound is happening. And ultimately, it's because the political underpinnings, the political support for what we've been doing in our policy making, and particularly in our economies, has eroded to the point of collapse. What that will mean, we can perhaps discuss later. So let me start with the context. Well, the most important single point here, I just wanted to point out, which you all know, is that the growth rates of the developed countries have collapsed. And I'll just focus, this is from the IMF, and it brings out what's gone on, because this is why I think it's very long-term. So basically, economists, when they look at the supply-side potential of economies, this goes back to the work of a very great American economist, Robert Solow, in the 50s, they decompose it into 3 things. I won't go into how, that doesn't matter. But basically, there's capital growth, straight investment. There's the growth of the labor force, which is in red, and there's green, which is the magic bit, which is we call total factor productivity. You might think about as the rate at which of innovation, the rate at which we get smarter and smarter in turning capital and labor into valuable output. That's what you could think about it. And the pretty obvious point is after 2007, this collapsed. And the question is the IMF right in believing that there'll be a bit of a recovery? And the important point which you'll see in the last period. I'm not going to go into that in great deal, except to notice the components. There was a collapse in investment. That's not surprising. That happened as a result of the Great Recession, and that might return. There was a collapse in potential labor force growth. This is permanent. This is permanent and structural. Our labour forces are growing, it depends on the country. There are many developed countries where the labour force isn't growing at all. The US is growing relatively fast, but basically labour force growth has halved very suddenly. Why? Because the baby boomers are all retiring and we all have baby booms at the same time. I'm a baby boomer, very early. And the final thing is total factor productivity growth, which is innovation, has halved. And there is no sign of this reversing on which the IMF is optimistic, none whatsoever. It isn't an accident of statistics, it's real. And what this means is what we know at the moment is the potential growth of the developed world is somewhere between 1 and 1.5%. It might be a little bit around 1% in Europe, maybe 1.5% to 1.75% in the US. In other words, it's lower than it has been at any time, at least since the Second World War. And it is structural, and it changes everything. It changes fiscal prospect, changes everything. The second thing I wanted to stress is we have a really serious demand problem, and the way that is shown is that we have really unique, truly unique monetary policy. So what I've shown you here is the intervention rates, the official intervention rates of the major 4 developed country central banks. 2 are negative rates, 2 are barely positive. The UK actually, since this was produced, has just cut it further. And there are 2 things I'd like to bring out about this, well, perhaps 3. 1, they're basically all at or near zero. Second, this has never happened before in the history of the world. This is completely unique. And if you had told any economist that this was going to happen 10 years ago, 15 years ago, for 7 or 8 years, they would have said, and asked what would be the outcome, they would have said hyperinflation. And lots of people thought it would be hyperinflation. Have you noticed what's been happening to inflation recently? And the third point to note is to look at the blue line, which is Japan. Japan has had 20 years of zero rates, 20 years, and their major worry is getting inflation up. The third thing I wanted to say on the context is there are 2 completely different stories among the major economies of the world, the developed world, which are the US and the eurozone. So I'm going to come to the UK later. So both had very big recessions. Since the recession, the US economy has been growing at about 2% a year. Real demand has grown roughly in line with real GDP. This is the weakest recovery of the US economy on record, but it is a recovery. The eurozone, as you can see, has had 2 recessions, the Great Recession and then the eurozone crisis. Real demand has been incredibly weak, and it's had a very weak recovery, and output is only very recently returned to the pre-crisis level. Real demand in the eurozone is still well below the pre-crisis level. So as I say, essentially, there has been no recovery at all in the eurozone as a whole. And that explains a lot of the politics of Europe. Okay, before I get to that, let me just go on then to the second thing I want to talk about, which is why Brexit, and I'll come to this next chart. So why Brexit? Let me start with the voting patterns. Who voted to leave? Well, basically, it's very simple. First, there was a very clear gradation with age. So 27% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted to leave against 60% of the over 65. So there's a profound, deep difference. And by the way, it's a pretty smooth gradation across ages. The older you got, the more hostile you were to Europe. The second is non-graduates voted far more heavily to leave than graduates. There are far more non-graduates in the UK's population than graduates. It's diminishing the difference with age, but most people are over 45, 40, and most of them are non-graduates. The third category is wealth. Less well-off people voted more heavily to leave than the most well-off, so it was graduated with income. And finally, as has already been pointed, it graduated with location. Essentially, the parts of the country that voted overwhelmingly to stay in were London, Scotland, London and Scotland, most profoundly, for somewhat different reasons. So this was a rebellion, as it were, of the old against the young, the less educated against the educated, the less well-off against the more well-off, and the provinces against the metropolis. That's a pretty profound indication, and I think those in America, from America, will recognize the similarities with what's going on at home. The second thing which I wanted to bring out, which is in this chart, is this happened even though the UK's economic performance has, by European standards, indeed by developed country standards, not been that bad. So what I've put here is GDP per head across the major developed countries. And you can see that the UK had a reasonable recovery. It's up there on GDP per head terms with the US. Very, very similar. It's caught up. So it's not a real disaster. Bit below Canada, but well below Germany, far and away the most successful of these major countries. So the UK didn't have a terrible performance. But I wanted to bring out one other element which followed what I said about the eurozone, because I wanted to do it a bit more broadly than just about the developed country, the UK problem. And here you can understand a bit more about why the eurozone has such deep political economic problems, because of this massive divergence. Not only was there this very weak aggregate growth of the eurozone, which I've shown you, but there's also been incredibly wide divergence in the performance of the eurozone. And the extreme cases I wanted to stress, because I think they're going to be the stress points in the next few years, and you can see it already, is between Germany on the one hand and Italy on the other. Over a period of 8 years, basically 8 or 9 years, German GDP per head has risen relative to Italian GDP per head by approximately 20% in just a few years. In addition, I don't have time to show that, Italy has very high unemployment, which isn't showing any signs of falling. Spain had a similar collapse, but it's beginning to recover. You can see it's beginning to recover. But Germany has done fantastically well. Italy has done fantastically badly. And this makes it really difficult to keep things together. France, by the way, is in the middle, and it's absolutely stagnant. So this is the political stress of the eurozone. The third thing I wanted to talk about, so the UK was in the middle on this. Now, before I get to that, I just wanted to add one point. The UK doesn't look too bad here, but I think it's important to dig a bit more deeply, particularly when I've already talked about the way the less well-off voted and so forth, because the standard of living of people has not done as well as GDP per head has done. This is really very important, partly because the government has had to close this huge fiscal deficit we had 5 or 6 years ago. So median UK income, overall, median UK, not average, is only 2% above the crisis level in July 2016. So basically, we've had 8 years of median income stagnation. 8 years of median income stagnation. In real terms. This comes from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. This is quite certainly the longest period of median income stagnation in the UK since, interestingly, the 1920s. Since the 1920s. The 30s, by the way, were rather a good decade for the UK, but that's another story. I won't go into why that was the case. And the 20s were grim, unlike in the US. Secondly, for adults aged 31 to 59, median income is at pre-crisis levels, and for those aged 22 to 30, it's actually 7% lower. Their anger, the latter group's anger, is coming out in different ways, most notably, by the way, in the phenomenon of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party. We haven't seen, just to stress, such low growth in median real wages, median real incomes in our economy, as I've already told you, since the 1920s. And that means that though GDP per head performance is relatively good, from the British point of view, it feels really bad. And that, I think, again, is a bit like the US story. The final element of the story that I want to stress is what's happened to migration, because it's obviously very, very clear that one of the reasons people voted the way they did is the hostility over what they see as a vast wave of immigration which they were not prepared for and had not planned for. And the immigration picture in the UK, which I've got here, the net migrant inflows by different sources, is, I think, rather interesting. The first is, over the period since 2006, there's been no fundamental structural shift. Net inflows have remained in the sort of 200 to 300,000 range. It's much higher than it was in the 1990s, but it hasn't fundamentally changed. That's point one. Point two, the immigration from the EU, as you will also see in net terms, has never been more than half of the net immigration. So the focus we've had on EU immigration has been rather surprising. The reason for the focus is, however, and it's very important to understand this, is under EU rules, we can't control it. So the debate ended up not really about the principles or the size of net migration, but over whether we can control migration at all. The third thing I want to bring out is that we had a pretty big increase in net migration between 2013 and 2015 and 16, the year to March. And it's very fascinating to look at the source of that. It wasn't the Central and Eastern Europeans that everybody was looking at. The main source of this big increase in net migration over that period was actually the old EU countries. Countries like Spain and Germany, well, not Germany, Spain, France, Italy, Portugal. What was going on there? It's one of those great ironies of history that we decided to hold this referendum at the time of the eurozone crisis, and a very large number of young, early middle-aged people clearly decided that things were so grim they might as well come and live in London. And that pushed up these figures surprisingly much. And it is, I think, one of those triggers, accidental triggers, of the resentment about migration, because the numbers were such a significant factor. By the way, in terms of the stock of migrants in our economy, particularly from the EU, over the period, we have ended up with some quite large shifts, and there are roughly 3 million EU migrants now living in the UK. It's not vast in a country of well over 60 million. It's quite interesting, however, that over a period of 12 years, the people from Poland have ended up as the biggest single stock. They are a third of these EU migrants, and it probably does explain the deplorable outbreak of anti-Polish violence, which you probably have been reading about the country. So the next thing I want to talk about is what happens next. So this is my discussion of where we got to. So the question is then, what happens next? Well, basically, the UK now has to make some absolutely fundamental choices. And it's pretty clear, perhaps that the government is not yet in a position to make these choices. Indeed, the confusions of the last week have underlined how difficult it is for them to make these choices. The first and fundamental choice is they have three fundamental considerations. The first consideration is sovereignty, the extent to which Britain is able to make its own rules and laws. The second fundamental consideration is control over migration, how far Britain can and should control migration and in what ways. And the third is market access, the terms and conditions of market access to the EU. And the government has to make some really fundamental choices on those three dimensions. There are very big trade-offs here between, for instance, market access on the one hand and sovereignty over regulations and rules and over trade policy and sovereignty over immigration on the other. And it's absolutely clear that the Brexit campaign never worked out what it wanted to do, the government hasn't worked out what it wants to do, and nobody knows what is going to happen. Nobody knows what's going to happen. The second question they face is the timing of triggering the exit process, which starts them on a 20-year process, and that is when they trigger Article 50 of the EU, which will give it a 2-year window for negotiating the exit alone, not the post-exit relationship with the EU, the exit alone. It has to decide at the most fundamental level, just following from this, whether after it's exited, it wishes to stay in the customs union, the common external tariff, and or the single market. If it stays in the customs union, it will be unable to negotiate free trade agreements with anyone else in the world. But it would, at the same time, obviate the need for every manufacturer from the UK to produce a vastly complicated set of bureaucratic documents proving the local content of every good that they export to the EU. So that's a trade-off, customs union or local content requirements. And the other one on the single market is the trade-off is between having all the single market regulations imposed upon us without having any voice in them anymore because we've left the EU, or being outside the single market, which has a decided effect, particularly on services. So that's a third really big choice. It's pretty clear that if it wants immigration controls, it will lose market access. The nature of that choice has not yet been confronted. And finally, when it's reached all these decisions, had all these negotiations, which will probably take somewhere around 5 to 7 years in total, it will have to decide on its own regulatory framework in basically every single area of British economic, environmental, labour market and other policies. So we have started on a process which will consume, ineluctably, British policy making for up to a decade. I don't think there's any doubt about that. We could get through it economically or not. Now, the obvious question then is, what are the economic costs of that going to be? Well, I've just put forward some guesses put before the referendum, so give you some sense of the framework. These are forecasts of what might happen to GDP by 2020 and 2030 relative to the pre-crisis level. They all, pre-Brexit assumptions, they all assume continued growth, but some of them obviously imply some quite large reductions in the short term. For instance, if we take the most optimistic of the short-run ones, the LSE's one, they think the economy will be about 1.25%, 1.5% smaller by 2020 than otherwise. And that will be against the normal assumption that the economy would expand by 7 or 8%. So we lose about 1/7 of growth. And some think it's much worse than that. We don't know how big the negative consequences will be. It's just one of those uncertainties. But it seems to me overwhelmingly probable that over the time horizon I've been talking about, 5 to 10 years, the results are going to be negative, at least to some degree. Finally, very last comment, what are the implications of this? What are the implications of the Brexit vote more broadly beyond what it says, what it means for the UK itself? Well, first, it's a demonstration of the power of populist anger. It really in important and stable, historically quite stable democracy. It's an indication, I think, of the political impacts of low growth, low increases in the standard of living, and the longer-term lag of the impact of the financial crisis, which I've already talked to you about. It's a very clear demonstration that migration has become a front-rank issue in developed countries. It clearly was a driving force. It was a profound indication of the loss of faith in experts and elites. Michael Gove, whom I know quite well, said we've heard enough from experts, and obviously the majority of the British people agreed with him. As one of the experts, I felt suitably rebuffed. It's a profound indication of resistance to at least some aspects of globalization. How far that goes, we don't know. It's an indication that people feel that democratic legitimacy is being lost, that their country, as was pointed out, is being taken away from them. It will have significant long-run costs for the UK. How big, we don't know. And it is a substantial shock to the EU too, but I can't discuss that further, except to bring back, which is why I had all that stuff on the eurozone. The eurozone economy is very weak already, very stressed already. Having the Brexit and the example of Brexit thrown into the mix can only make the problems of Europe, at least in the short to medium term, more difficult. So those are my thoughts on the mess we're in. And I'm very happy to talk to Darcy.
It's a very uplifting picture, isn't it?
Well,
so I've just been told we're going to give this 15 extra minutes because, as you can see, there's a lot to unpack, and I want there to make sure that there's enough time for questions as well. I'll kick off with 2 questions, and then we'll open it up. That way there's time for everyone. I have about 15, but I'll save those because I have a feeling you'll probably have some too. My first question for you is, the UK has been a link to the EU for the rest of the world, on the economic stage, on the political stage. Will its position and its influence diminish now that Brexit is a reality?
I think, well, first, its position as a bridge is gone, will be gone. I'm assuming that we do go through the exit process, that we will formally cease to be a member of the EU. There is a possibility that won't happen, but though I'd love it not to happen, but I don't think it's likely. So we will leave. So the bridge role, which is both economic and political, will go. We will no longer have a voice in the councils of the EU. So if the EU continues to survive, which I hope and I think is likely, then people will have to find another way of communicating with the EU, which is politically quite significant. Important foreign governments, the US most obviously, obviously had relationships with all member countries, but the relationships which were most important to the US were those with Germany, France, and the UK. And with the UK, it's very special and deep, though of course Germany is more important, and that's gone. So they're going to have to redo that. But there's also an economic aspect of it. Britain obviously speaks English, far more European people, and indeed European people, speak English than any other foreign language. So setting up a business here was relatively easy. People were also relatively familiar with our laws, legal systems, and so forth. So Britain was a magnet for foreign direct investment. The Japanese, for example, established their plants here in large measure because they felt comfortable and familiar with it. We were welcoming. And obviously, all these people are going to have to reconsider what they do. Similarly, with the complexity of the financial sector, I don't think they will abandon Britain completely. I think that's rather unlikely, but I suspect at the margin, and the margin might be quite a big margin, they will be already thinking about and planning movement inside the EU. As I've already indicated, if we leave the customs union for manufacturers, the free trade option is very unattractive because I won't go through why, we could discuss it, but because it creates this bureaucratic problem that you have to prove that this product you're making is actually British and not just a rebadged product which you got from somewhere else, because that's a way around the customs barrier. So there are a lot of bureaucratic problems associated with leaving the customs union, but if we don't leave the customs union, we don't have a trade policy. So I think from a political point of view and from an economic point of view, Britain ceased to be a bridge. The security point aspect is less clear. It hinges very much on the future of NATO. And the future of NATO, I think, depends far more, it depends a little on Britain, but it depends far more on the future foreign policy of the United States, which is pretty clearly a core issue in this campaign in the US, and of course, future relations with outside powers, notably Russia. And there, the British decision is secondary. But I think it is, and the net effect of all this is the UK post-imperial, post-superpower, 100 years since Britain was a truly great power, But Britain was a bridge in many directions. It tried to be a member of the whole British foreign policy since the 50s, since 62, let's say, when Macmillan applied to the EU, was that Britain will basically make up for its obvious objective decline by being a member of everything possible. And that's why he, by no means temperamentally inclined in that direction, decided to go for EU membership, which was a core policy of the British establishment, very broadly defined, since the early 1960s. So this has overturned that, and this means that Britain's future, presumably, in some way, is as a very, very large, relatively large, relatively freewheeling sort of Singapore. How that plays out, I have no idea.
Okay. And London as a financial center, does it last?
Yes, the answer to that is London stays a financial center because it has a very large installed base in every possible dimension. It stays a financial center, but it becomes what it was trying to be. Well, there are two elements. One question is, what's the future of the financial system itself? Mm-hmm. And I think this could turn out to be wrong, but my sort of hunch is we've got 30 years of decline in the financial sector ahead of us. So I think we've seen the apogee of the financial sector as an entity is prone to very, very large cycles of liberalization, debt, credit growth, crisis, and contraction. And I think we're on the contraction side relatively. So
and what's driving that? Digital disruption?
No, digital is a small element, but the major thing is there's the basic underlying fuel of finance is debt. There are lots of other things, but basically the underlying fuel is the ability to grow debt. Debt and money, they go together. And we can't have any more in the private sector because if you really try, everybody will go under. So, we already are the most indebted in the private sector. That's not quite true, but we were in 2007-8 the most indebted in the private sector in the history of the West. And so you can't triple it again. So that means that, one of my favorite statistics is between the early 1980s, to 2007, the financial sector's balance sheets in aggregate from the Fed statistics grew 6 times faster than US GDP. Okay, 6 times faster. Here they grew 10 times faster than GDP. You can't do that again. That's a once in all time boom. And so that's over. So that's not going to happen again. The financial sector, and every sign we see, you just look at the profits, look at the growth of the balance sheet, employment, financial sector is not doing what it did in 2000 to 2007. And that's going to go on. That's structural. We have more of this stuff than we need. Well, we can discuss why. I think we've got much more than we need, but that's another matter. There will be big growth in the financial sector, and there really will be, but it'll be in Asia. It's got a lot more to go. We're not in a booming market anymore, I think. But the other point, of course, which is crucial, is that we tried to be at one and the same time a great international entrepot and the financial capital of Europe. That was new. The latter was new. That was not a role we'd historically played. Historically, at the boom periods of British finance in the late 19th, early 20th century, we were the financial capital of the world, and particularly of the imperial system. I think our role as the financial capital of Europe will ineluctably diminish somewhat. The financial entrepot for the world will continue and might grow. So over time, we will become, and this will, I think, become obvious, will become somewhat more of a very large offshore center, as I said, a very large Singapore or Hong Kong, and less of the dominant financial center. I suspect we will remain the biggest single financial center in Europe. I think it would be unlikely that wouldn't happen, but quite a bit of business will cumulatively move somewhere else in the continent.
Which would be to?
I would guess a bit of everywhere. It won't go freely because there are lots of problems. My guess would be still that it's difficult to see a lot of it not ending up in Frankfurt. I mean, if the euro survives, Germany is the heart. And some will go to Dublin because of the tax advantage, some will go to the Netherlands, a little will go to Paris, but it seems to me, in the medium to long run, sensible. If I were running an American bank, I wanted political cover, I wanted to feel I was part, really talking to the powerful and important people in Europe, really powerful and important people, I'd want a pretty big base in Frankfurt because that's where the ECB is and it's in Germany. I don't know whether that's true, but that's my guess.
So pivot a bit, one more question from me, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. As I'm an American, and there are lots of us in the room, you mentioned similarities to the situation in the US in terms of wage stagnation and slow recovery, and also to the situation in the UK and Europe.
And the focus on migration is an issue.
And the political that leads to the political situation that we find ourselves in and the two candidates. And in particular, I'm curious what your view is on what a Trump presidency would mean for the world. I
think this is really beyond the absolute terror I feel. I think it's an unbelievable, that is perhaps the single most important, or by no means the only one, why I think we're at a regime shift point. So you can see it with Brexit, you can see it obviously with the strength of support for Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders, and even the AfD in Germany, quite striking in the last election. So there's a lot of this around in the West for the reasons we've discussed, a mixture of xenophobia, worry about migration, worry about stagnant real incomes, a sense of being a loser. But obviously, there are 2 points to be made about the possible change in the US. One is general and one is personal, as it were. The US has played since Pearl Harbor, you can date it quite precisely, a completely unique role in the world, in that it guaranteed that democracies would come out of the Second World War in pretty good shape. If it hadn't become involved in the Second World War, either Germany or the Soviet Union would have won. It's pretty clear. That would have meant a completely different Europe, and Japan would not have been defeated. So that would have been a different Asia. And after the war, the Americans basically created the world system which confronted communism, which was based on international institutions, some sort of rule-based order, never perfect, the American security guarantee, market-oriented economies, capitalism. And this set of ideas proved incredibly successful. They led to an immense economic recovery in Japan and Europe. And then, crucially, Deng Xiaoping and later the Indians too saw this and said, this is sort of working rather better than the Soviet Union, isn't it? And so we're going to go in that direction. People may not realize this, but I worked at the World Bank in the 70s, so I can remember it very well. What was Deng Xiaoping looking at? Well, one of the things he was looking at was what they called the Four Little Tigers, or Four Little Dragons, which were Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. Forget about Hong Kong and Singapore, less important. I mean, Deng Xiaoping looked at Taiwan and South Korea, both of which development was completely overseen. I experienced this at first hand. I'm old enough to remember this at first hand, the case of Korea, by the Americans. And he said, well, they've done that. We can do this too. Why shouldn't we grow at 10% a year for 35 years? That'll change the world. And he was right. So then the Soviet Union collapsed. The sole superpower moment emerged. So the United States is the creator of the world system and the undergirder of the world system. And that involved taking responsibilities upon itself, accepting constraints on its behavior, rules, WTO and all the rest of it, in the interest of giving comfort to other lesser countries. In essence, what I think Trump is about is a rejection of all that. That's not his view of what the US as a great power should be. His view of what the US as a great power should be, in my view, is a great big Russia. Perfectly coherent, great power view, but not that principle. And then that obviously goes with the fact that he's a let me put it gently, slightly erratic human being, which makes it a bit unpredictable what he will do from day to day. The combination of those two things seems to me, if it happens, potentially, I want to be very precise, a change of the world system, as fundamental a change in the world system as the realization between the wars that the UK and France together could no longer stabilize Europe, and therefore the world had become, after the First World War, an international anarchy, which is what the US ended up stepping into. So I think this is very profound. What this happens, how the rest of the world responds, how China responds, what systems emerge, but I think it reshapes all the alliance patterns in the world and makes the next 10, 15 years really wildly unpredictable, even if we manage to avoid little things like wars and nuclear wars.
Okay, I would like to open it up to, to some questions from the audience.
Exhausted volcanoes.
Yes, Perry.
Hi, I had a question. You started off by saying that you really didn't think it was possible to wind this back. I'd just like to hear a little bit more about that, because honestly, I'm still kind of hoping that we can figure out how to wind it back. So could you tell us a little bit more about why you don't think that...
You mean Brexit?
Yeah.
Okay. I am not able to wind back the American presidential election so that Republicans choose a different candidate, can I? I rather liked Bush, but never mind. There are friends of mine who think we could wind it back. And the way it would have to work, I'll describe what I think is a technical way you could do it, and then I will describe, on which I'm much less expert, the politics of it. Technically, you could say that the citizens of our fair country have decided to leave the EU, but they haven't decided what that means, because nobody knew what it meant. And they only decided it by 51.9 to 48.1, roughly, which is a pretty small margin. And what they should really do is now negotiate what Brexit means. And for proper democratic legitimacy, we should then go to the people and say, okay, we haven't actually left yet. We can still withdraw our application. Article 50 appears, technically, it is argued by senior lawyers, to allow us to withdraw the application to leave. So we go to the British people 2 years hence, 2.5 years hence, before it's expired, and say, well, this is the best we can do in terms of our negotiations. It means A, B, C, D, E. The alternative is to withdraw and stay in, and there are very powerful reasons for doing that, because either we're completely outside the market, we have the same relationship with the market as the United States does, which is pretty bad for us because that's our biggest market by far, which isn't true for the US, or we have to accept EU regulations without having any voice. So basically, the best I can do is much worse than staying in, and I suggest you reconsider your vote. Okay, we could.
And why is that so unlikely?
The difficulty with that, I think, is that well, there are two difficulties. One technical, one political. The political difficulty is the people on the Leave side, who are very, very important in the Conservative Party, very, very important, will regard that as a betrayal of democracy, a betrayal of their achievement, and the Conservative Party is likely, I think, if the government went that way, to split. I mean, really split, with large chunks going off to UKIP. And I don't think Mrs. May is up for that sort of situation. And I think if you look at the composition of the Conservative Party, I believe that's what would happen. But as I said, I'm not an expert on politics, so maybe that's wrong. But the second and more technical problem is what I tried to indicate, and I know I did this very, very quickly. Britain has to negotiate leaving. That's what the 2-year under Article 50 gives you. Leaving is only, quote, only about things like how we handle the budgets, how we handle the people who work for the EU, how we divide up assets and liabilities, what we do about things like the Medicines Authority, which is here, and the European Banking Regulator. There are lots and lots of technical issues which will consume that. And leaving the EU formally, it is likely, probably certain, unless we are very fortunate, that the rest of the leaving package, which is the future trading relationship with the EU, are we part of the customs union? Do we have a free trade agreement, which is not a customs union? Are we in the single market or not? If we're not in the single market, do we have special deals on some sectors, like the Swiss on insurance? Immense question. What are we going to do about fisheries? We do share a large amount of waters. What are we going to do about our agricultural? Some of that we might be able to get around. But that's not going to be resolved in 2 years. But we were, by this timetable, we would have left. So the question is, when in this process could we have this second referendum? When the second referendum, as I said, the point of it will be to go to the people and say, this is the alternative. Now we can present you with two alternatives. I don't think we get to that point, at least not within 5, 6 years. So I think once you trigger the exit, the process of getting to the exit is not one you can halt and say, we now know truly what the alternative is, because I think we won't. The only way we could do that quickly, and there is a way we could do it quickly, is if we said the alternative is we're going to leave, and initially we're going to treat our relationship with the EU essentially as if we were another WTO member. And I don't think that's it. That's the deal. There are one or two people. I think Liam Fox would be up for that. David Davis might be, but the weight of the government is not up for that. And the British business sector is violently, the big business sector, opposed to that. So I don't think they could reach that deal. So I think once we trigger Article 50, I think we then start a very long process, multi-year process. To take one example, the free trade agreement. The Canadians and the EU have been negotiating for 7 years on a free trade agreement, which covers nothing like as much as we would cover. Now, it's true we have the advantage we're inside and we have a regulatory equivalence, but regulatory equivalence, you say, that simplifies a lot on the single market side. But that means that we will be committed to maintaining regulatory equivalence forever, which means every time the EU change a regulation, we would have to follow them, in which case we have no sovereignty at all. So I just don't see the deal that would allow us to go to the people. There can't be another referendum. The only way to do that is simply to say, no, we have to stop now. It was all insane. The referendum was an asinine idea. It's purely advisory. We are parliamentary sovereign. That's the whole point. All the Brexiters say we are so we're going to ignore the referendum. Silly idea, which we never used to have referenda till 75. But politically, that would lead, I think, to probably the breakdown of order. It will be more or less impossible to do. So I'm afraid, in the greatest depression, I think we are screwed. We are leaving.
Thank you very much. I think we can fit in one more question. If anybody, yes, right over here.
I'm a little nervous to ask this question because I'm already ready for the cocktail after listening. But we've spent a lot of time talking about the rise of populism and all the roots of that. But for this room, and I'm again hesitant to ask it, I'm curious what your diagnosis is of how the elite, the global elite, the democratic capitalist elite, as a student of capitalism, how did we, and I'll include all of us in this, how did we get it so wrong on both sides of the Atlantic, excuse me, in terms of understanding what was going on, acting upon it, having access to the kind of data that you have put up on the board? What's your diagnosis of how there was such complacency, in a sense, in the lead up on both sides of the Atlantic?
Okay. Well, I'm not a really deep aspect. I mean, I'm trying to write a book on it, so I'm going to have to read a lot about it. I think there were two classes a mistake which came together. And one wasn't a mistake. It was, or perhaps the third, which is really so deep, difficult to avoid. The first and most obvious one, and I was part of that, to some extent, is we didn't imagine that the financial sector would implode in the way it did. I have recently been rereading the conference which was organized by the Fed, I think it was organized by the Fed, in 2005 in advance of Greenspan's departure. Read the papers. Okay? This was the best and brightest on where the financial system was. There was a very, very famous speech there by Raghuram Rajan, who later became governor of the Reserve Bank, in which he said, the financial system really worries the hell out of me. He didn't say it would all end in, but it really worries me. And basically, the established might of the economics profession and Fed there came down upon him like a ton of bricks. So the first thing is, we didn't know what was going on. I wasn't, I think, as ignorant as some of them, but the scale of the catastrophe in 2008, 7, 8 was not something that the people understood, how fragile the system, exposed we're all. And of course, that goes without that it did immense economic damage. I mean, there's no question, immense economic damage, which we're still living with. So that was the first mistake. The second one follows from the first, is people understood that inequality was tending to rise, but since they assumed the economies would grow 2% a year or so, okay, it's true, some people were doing much better than others, but basically, more or less, everybody was getting something. It's true in the US was rather extreme. The rise in inequality in the US was extreme, but the economy was relatively dynamic. There was lots of free stuff, as it were. So people felt, yeah, you can live with that. We can live with that. And that was supported, of course, by the general shift after 1980 in a more conservative direction, which was led by the consequences of the 70s, which became the dominant thrust of policy, which was towards more liberalization, more globalization, and so forth. So that's the second thing. The third thing, which I think is the really deep one, which is what I've been thinking about a lot, and it is actually my globalization book already, which was written in 2002-03, but not well enough, which is this. If you have a successful globalization process, which creates lots of wealth around the world, the economic and business elite is going to become global itself. It's going to become increasingly globally oriented. It's going to look I can give you many examples, but you would know even better than I. Businesses will think of themselves as global. They won't think of themselves as attached to and fundamentally based in a nation state. They will think of themselves as global. Major companies think that way. A bit less in the US because it's so vast, but everywhere else, really, that's the way they think. But the political underpinnings of the institutional order which supports globalization, the rule of law, and the rest of it, is all domestic. It's national. And the people in these countries look at what their companies and elites are doing, and they increasingly feel over time, and it's just baked in the system that I've described, that these people don't care about them because they're not attached to them. They don't see why they should pay tax to their jurisdiction. They feel that it's perfectly reasonable for them. Indeed, it's mandatory for them to construct their tax arrangements for the benefit of their shareholders. And if that means they can construct their arrangement in such a way that they're actually resident nowhere, that's ideal. But cumulatively, people sort of notice that. And therefore, the disjunction between the domestic politics and the global order become increasingly obvious. As I put in one of my, and there's a very deep, simple point about it, which links with the migration issue, I think. One of the things we tend to forget, which is probably not true for anyone in this room, I don't know, but it's true for most people in the Western world, the most valuable asset they have is their citizenship. the country of which they were, the principal determinant of the real income of people with relatively modest skill in the world, relatively modest skill, is what country they're citizen of. If you're a bus driver in the US or a bus driver in Kenya, you're doing the same job, your real wage is utterly different. They know this, and trade and migration erodes that advantage. And they're quite rational to feel that. And so you've got to give them something else. What I've been arguing now for many years is if you don't structure the democratic economy in such a way that everybody feels they're potentially a gainer, you're going to get very, very serious political problems. I've been writing about this not long enough, but at least for a decade. But it's clear now to me that this has got to crisis point. And the most intriguing thing to me of all is that the party that in the US, and here too in the way, that it's the right, the party of the free market, that has been taken over by this fundamentally anti-market stance. Now, I can then spend a long time discussing why that's the case. It's not new. It's always been an element on the right. But it creates a monstrous crisis for the right-wing parties, just as the center-left parties have become intellectually, virtually, completely empty. So what it seems to me, I was asked once, what is the basic conflict between the Democrats and the Republicans in terms of economic policy today, looking at the election. And my feeling is the Democrats offer a status quo which doesn't work very well, and the Republicans have gone off the reservation. How you choose between these two, I have no idea. But that seems to me the core. Those are the three elements in, I think, what's gone wrong. And this is the absolute last point. These are very deep problems. We have no answers. At the moment, we have no answers. And because we don't have good answers, what will be elected are bad answers. And that's what's become so fantastically dangerous. And apart from that, everything's fine.
I was going to say, we're out of time. But thank you very much, Martin.